The Taiwan Powder Keg. The war that could end the world. Welcome to Epic Origins. Every system you live inside was designed by someone. The question is whether you were ever meant to see the blueprint. Today, we are not decoding a hidden financial structure or a buried chapter of colonial history. Today, we are decoding the architecture of the next world war. 100 miles of open water. That is all that separates the world's second largest economy from a self-governing island of 23 million people. And that thin ribbon of sea is what the Council on Foreign Relations now calls the most dangerous flashpoint on the planet. Taiwan is not a new crisis. It is an unfinished civil war. Frozen for 77 years, now thawing under the heat of superpower rivalry, military modernization, and one man's vision of national destiny. Prediction markets currently give an 11% chance that China launches a military operation against Taiwan by the end of 2026. That may sound small, but for an event that could trigger $10 trillion in global economic damage and draw the United States, Japan, Australia, and others into direct combat with a nuclear-armed superpower, it is terrifying. This is the story of how we got here, and what happens if the powder keg finally ignites. To understand why China is willing to risk everything for a small island, you have to go back to the war that split one nation into two. The Chinese Civil War began in 1927 as a power struggle between the Kuomintang nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese Communist Party led by Mao Zedong. Both sides temporarily united to fight Japan during World War II. But the moment Japan surrendered in 1945, the war resumed with devastating intensity. By late 1949, the Communists had swept across mainland China. The three decisive campaigns of Liaoshen, Pingjin, and Huaihai shattered nationalist resistance. Over 6 million people were dead or wounded. On October 1, 1949, Mao stood atop Tiananmen Gate and proclaimed the People's Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek and roughly 2 million soldiers and civilians fled across the strait to the island of Taiwan. They called it a temporary retreat. It was anything but temporary. Chiang established his government in Taipei and proclaimed it the sole legitimate government of all China. Across the strait, Mao said the same about Beijing. Neither side signed a peace treaty. Neither side surrendered. The war simply froze. That frozen conflict is the original fracture from which every modern tension flows, and both sides know it. And this is where the story gets complicated, because the United States walked right into the middle of it. When the Korean War erupted in June 1950, President Truman ordered the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait. Almost overnight, Taiwan went from being a Chinese problem to an American strategic interest. Washington and Taipei signed a mutual defense treaty in 1954. For 2 decades, the Republic of China on Taiwan held China's seat at the United Nations. Most Western nations recognized Taipei, not Beijing, as the legitimate government of China, but the chessboard was shifting. In 1971, the United Nations voted to expel Taiwan and seat the People's Republic. In 1972, Nixon shook hands with Mao in Beijing, and in 1979, the United States formally recognized the PRC and severed official diplomatic ties with Taipei. Yet Washington made a critical promise. The Taiwan Relations Act of 1979 committed the United States to provide Taiwan with defensive arms and to maintain the capacity to resist any resort to force that would jeopardize Taiwan's security. It was deliberately ambiguous, a masterpiece of diplomatic hedging that has kept the peace for over 4 decades. But ambiguity has a shelf life, and in the 21st century, that shelf life is running out. The Taiwan Strait has been a theater of crisis at least 4 times, each escalation more dangerous than the last. In September 1954, communist artillery began shelling the nationalist-held islands of Quemoy and Matsu, just miles off the mainland coast. The Eisenhower administration considered everything from abandoning the islands to using nuclear weapons. Congress passed the Formosa Resolution, authorizing the president to defend Taiwan. The crisis eased only after China signaled a willingness to negotiate. In 1958, the PLA resumed heavy bombardment of Quemoy, firing tens of thousands of shells. The United States escorted nationalist supply convoys and again considered nuclear options. Beijing eventually reduced the shelling to an odd days-only ritual that would continue symbolically for 2 decades. But the real turning point came in 1995. The United States granted a visa to Taiwanese President Lee Teng-hui to visit Cornell University. Beijing was furious. The PLA fired missiles into waters near Taiwan and conducted massive exercises, including simulated amphibious landings. China deployed over 100,000 troops to Fujian province. Missiles landed close to the island, one flying almost directly over Taipei. The United States responded by sending 2 aircraft carrier battle groups through the Taiwan Strait. It was the largest American naval deployment in Asia since Vietnam. Beijing backed down, but Chinese military leaders took a very different lesson from that humiliation. In 1996, China's military was decades behind. Their air force was from the 1970s and early 1980s in terms of capability. They vowed never to be caught weak again. That vow would drive 3 decades of the most ambitious military modernization program in modern history. But here is what makes the Taiwan situation unlike any other flashpoint on Earth. While China was building a war machine, Taiwan was building something far more subversive to Beijing's plans: a democracy. In 1987, martial law was lifted after 38 years. In 1991, Taiwan declared an end to its state of war with the mainland. In 1996, the same year Chinese missiles splashed down nearby, Taiwan held its first direct presidential election. Democracy took root fast, and with it came a distinct Taiwanese identity, separate from Chinese nationalism. Polls consistently show that the overwhelming majority of Taiwanese people identify as Taiwanese rather than Chinese. Fewer than 5% support unification with the mainland. This is the paradox that haunts Beijing. The longer Taiwan governs itself, the less Chinese its people feel. And that clock only moves in one direction. Now let me introduce you to the man who has made this crisis personal. When Xi Jinping took power in 2012, he articulated a vision he called the China Dream: national rejuvenation by 2049, the centennial of the People's Republic. Unifying Taiwan is not a footnote in this vision. It is the centerpiece. Xi has stated that the Taiwan question cannot be passed from generation to generation. In 2019, he declared unification inevitable and military force an option. In 2022, the Communist Party enshrined reunification as a historic mission indispensable to China's rejuvenation. Under Xi, the People's Liberation Army has undergone its most sweeping transformation in history. China now fields the world's largest navy by number of vessels. It has developed anti-ship ballistic missiles specifically designed to keep American carriers at bay. It has built amphibious assault ships, practiced island seizure operations, and constructed the logistical infrastructure for a cross-strait invasion. By 2025, the PLA made significant gains toward its 2027 modernization goals. Amphibious lift, long-range strike, joint firepower, and counter-intervention operations all improved. Specialists in Chinese elite politics describe Xi as a calculated risk-taker rather than a reckless gambler. Someone who strengthens China's position incrementally rather than staking everything on a single roll of the dice. But calculated risk-takers can still miscalculate, and this is where the story enters its most dangerous chapter. On August 2nd, 2022, U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi landed in Taipei, the highest-ranking American official to visit Taiwan in 25 years. Beijing's response was immediate and unprecedented. China launched its largest military exercises since 1996, but this time they dwarfed those earlier operations. The PLA fired 11 ballistic missiles into waters surrounding Taiwan, some landing in Japan's exclusive economic zone. For the first time in history, missiles flew over the main island. 49 aircraft penetrated Taiwan's air defense identification zone in a single day. Exercise zones encircled Taiwan from all directions. Unlike 1996, the United States did not send carrier groups through the strait. Analysts noted the muted response, and so did Beijing. The exercises did not end. They became the new normal. In April 2023, another round of drills simulated a full blockade after Taiwan's president met with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. In October 2024, more exercises followed William Lai's presidential inauguration. Then came December 2025. China deployed over 90 warships across the region, its single largest maritime deployment to date. Ships formed parallel walls east of Taiwan, simulating blockade operations. It was the first time China had conducted an operation of this scale during winter. Each drill pushes the envelope further. Each establishes a new baseline. What was once provocative becomes routine. What was once a red line becomes a starting point. And this is where history becomes genuinely dangerous. Now I need you to understand why the entire world has a stake in this island. And the answer can be measured in nanometers. Taiwan produces over 60% of the world's semiconductors and more than 90% of the most advanced chips. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC, is arguably the most important company most people have never heard of. Apple, Nvidia, AMD, Qualcomm. Every major technology company on the planet depends on TSMC's fabrication plants to manufacture the chips that power our phones, our cars, our weapon systems, and the artificial intelligence revolution. In 2024, Taiwan's semiconductor industry generated over $165 billion in revenue, roughly 20% of the country's entire GDP. Some analysts call this Taiwan's silicon shield. The idea that the world's dependence on Taiwanese chips makes an invasion too economically catastrophic for anyone to attempt. The Institute for Economics and Peace estimates that a full-scale conflict over Taiwan could result in a $10 trillion loss to the global economy. Every modern automobile contains between 1,000 and 3,500 semiconductors. The AI boom, military modernization worldwide, the entire digital economy, all depend on chips that overwhelmingly come from one island in the Western Pacific. But the silicon shield cuts both ways. If China captures TSMC intact, it gains leverage over every nation on Earth. If the factories are destroyed in combat, the world plunges into technological crisis. Either outcome reshapes the global order. The United States, Europe, Japan, and South Korea are racing to build domestic semiconductor capacity. TSMC has committed over $100 billion to new fabrication plants in Arizona, but experts say it will take years, possibly a decade, before the world can meaningfully reduce its dependence on Taiwan. Until then, those fabrication plants in Hsinchu are among the most strategically important real estate on the planet. And this is where the story darkens. Because a war over Taiwan would not stay in the Taiwan Strait. It would go global. World War I began because a network of alliances turned a regional assassination into a worldwide catastrophe. The parallels are not exact, but they are deeply unsettling. A Chinese military operation against Taiwan would almost certainly draw in the United States under the Taiwan Relations Act. Japan hosts major U.S. military installations on Okinawa, just 400 miles from Taiwan. Any Chinese strike would likely target those bases, triggering Japan's security commitments. The Philippines, linked to the United States by a mutual defense treaty, sits astride the Bashi Channel south of Taiwan. Australia, a member of the AUKUS Pact, has signaled willingness to support Taiwan's defense. South Korea, though cautious, would face enormous pressure to choose sides. On the other side, China has deepened strategic ties with Russia and Iran. War game scenarios consistently show that in the event of a Taiwan conflict, Russia could be encouraged to escalate in Europe, while Iran stirs tensions in the Middle East, stretching American resources across 3 theaters simultaneously. The Council on Foreign Relations 2026 survey gives an even chance that multiple major flashpoints, including Taiwan, Russia and NATO, and the Middle East, could cascade within the same year. This is the nightmare scenario. Not one war, but 3 simultaneous crises feeding on each other. an alliance web that turns a regional confrontation into a global conflagration. In March 2021, Admiral Philip Davidson, then commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, told Congress that China could attempt to take Taiwan within 6 years, by 2027. This assessment created what strategists now call the Davidson window, a period of heightened vulnerability when China's military capabilities may reach a tipping point. At his confirmation hearing in January 2025, Secretary of State Marco Rubio echoed the warning. Unless something dramatic changes in Asia's military balance, China could attempt an invasion before the end of the decade. The House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party went even further, warning that this Congress may be America's last full chance to prevent war. But here is the nuance that most headlines miss. China enters 2026 with genuine military strengths, but also significant vulnerabilities. The PLA has not fought a war since 1979. Its officer corps was recently purged in a sweeping anti-corruption campaign. An amphibious invasion across 100 miles of open water against a prepared defender remains one of the most difficult military operations imaginable. China also faces economic headwinds. Growth is slowing. The property sector is fragile. Youth unemployment is high. Demographic decline is accelerating. The Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy has historically rested on improving living standards. A major conflict would jeopardize that compact entirely. Analysts at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute assess that a full invasion in 2026 is unlikely. Beijing is expected to persist with coercive actions designed to erode Taiwan's will and narrow its strategic options, while preserving flexibility for a future decision. But the risk of a crisis that spirals out of control is real and growing. The danger lies not in a calculated decision for war, but in miscalculation, accident, or a cascade of events that no single actor can control. Taiwan logged over 4,000 Chinese military incursions into its air defense identification zone in the first 9 months of 2025 alone. A new record. Taiwan's air defense is on constant alert. Analysts describe it as a recipe for disaster, where a military clash, intended or unintended, cannot be ruled out. Now let me lay out the numbers. Prediction markets, where real traders bet real money, give approximately 11% probability of a Chinese military offensive against Taiwan by the end of 2026. Over $10 million has been traded on that single question. The German Marshall Fund published a landmark report in January 2026 modeling 2 conflict scenarios between 2026 and 2030. In a minor conflict lasting several weeks, Chinese ships and aircraft surround Taiwan after deadly air and maritime clashes. In a major conflict lasting months, a full amphibious invasion leads to approximately 100,000 PLA casualties before forces withdraw. Taiwan suffers roughly 100,000 total casualties, half of them civilian. The United States loses 5,000 military personnel. Bloomberg estimates that a major conflict could cost China alone up to $10 trillion. China's annual exports account for 20% of GDP. A war risks severing its only remaining sources of economic growth. For the rest of the world, near total embargoes on trade with China would split the international economy into hostile blocs. Hong Kong would likely cease to function as a global financial hub. Foreign investment in China would collapse. The German Marshall Fund warns this could permanently damage the growth model that has underpinned China's rise. Mainstream analysts place the probability of a global multi-continent conflict erupting from cascading crises at roughly 20 to 30%, conditional on multiple flashpoints igniting simultaneously. Those are not the odds of a coin flip, but they are the odds of a loaded gun pointed at the global order. So can diplomacy prevent this? Every serious analyst agrees on one thing: conflict is not inevitable. The question is whether the conditions for peace can hold. Some observers argue that the Trump administration has paradoxically reduced the short-term risk of invasion, not through deterrence, but because Xi now believes he can extend influence over Taiwan, without gambling on a military operation. Trump's transactional approach to alliances gives Beijing hope that Washington's commitment to Taiwan may erode on its own. Beijing continues to manage its relationship with Washington tactically. Escalating over Taiwan in 2026 would undermine efforts to stabilize trade and technology access. China's economic headwinds argue against the enormous gamble of a military operation. But the clock is not on anyone's side. Taiwan's democracy deepens every year, making peaceful unification ever more remote. China's military window may narrow as the United States and its allies invest in new capabilities, and the risk of accidental escalation grows with every provocative drill. The Italian Institute for International Political Studies notes that while invasion is unlikely in the near term, China does not have nearly enough amphibious capability to actually seize the island. They can attack and bomb Taiwan. But crossing 100 miles of open water against a fortified defender is something else entirely. Diplomacy is not failing because the two sides have nothing to discuss. It is failing because the fundamental question, does Taiwan belong to China, has no answer both sides can accept. We began this story with 100 miles of open water. We end with the same image. But now you see it differently. That water has been contested since 1949. Missiles have flown over it. Carrier groups have sailed through it. Millions of people on both sides have lived their entire lives in its shadow, never knowing if tomorrow would bring peace or catastrophe. The prediction models give us numbers. 11% by December, 20 to 30% for a cascading global crisis. An even chance of a severe Taiwan crisis this year, according to America's most respected foreign policy institution. But numbers cannot capture the human reality. 23 million people who want nothing more than to live in freedom. And a government of 1.4 billion that sees their independence as an existential wound. The ingredients for the world's next great conflict are assembled. The alliances are in place. The weapons are built. The political will on both sides is hardening. What remains undecided is whether wisdom will prevail over ambition, whether deterrence will hold against impatience, and whether the frozen war of 1949 will finally, catastrophically, thaw. 100 miles of water, the most dangerous place on Earth. This has been Epic Origins. We do not deal in conspiracy, we deal in architecture. If this changed how you see the world, subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to understand what is happening in the Taiwan Strait. And stay close, because the next structure we decode is already in motion. Epoch Origins, the architecture of power, decoded.